In an hour and a half, Lestat and I were in New Orleans, the horses nearly dead from exhaustion, the carriage parked on a side street a block from a new Spanish hotel. Lestat had an old man by the arm and was putting $50 into his hand. "Get us a suite," he directed him, "and order some champagne. Say it's for 2 gentlemen, and pay in advance, and when you come back I'll have another 50 for you, and I'll be watching for you, I wager." His gleaming eyes held the man in thrall. I knew he'd kill him as soon as he returned with the hotel room keys. And he did. I sat in the carriage watching wearily as the man grew weaker and finally died, his body collapsing like a sack of rocks in a doorway as Lestat let him go. "Good night, sweet prince," said Lestat, "and here's your $50. And he shoved the money into his pocket as if it were a capital joke. Now we slipped in the courtyard doors of the hotel and went up to the lavish parlor of our suite. Champagne glistened in a frosted bucket. 2 glasses stood on the silver tray. I knew Lestat would fill 1 glass and sit there staring at the pale yellow color, and I, a man in a trance, lay on the settee staring at him as if nothing he could do mattered. I have to leave him or die, I thought. It would be sweet to die, I thought. Yes, die. I wanted to die before. Now I wish to die. I saw it with such sweet clarity, such dead calm. "You're being morbid," Lestat said suddenly. "It's almost dawn." He pulled the lace curtains back, and I could see the rooftops under the dark blue sky, and above the great constellation Orion. "Go kill," said Lestat, sliding up the glass. He slipped out of the sill, and I heard his feet land softly on the rooftop beside the hotel. He was going for the coffins, or at least one. My thirst rose in me like a fever, and I followed him. My desire to die was constant, like a pure thought in my mind, devoid of emotion. Yet I needed to feed. I've indicated to you I would not then kill people. I moved along the rooftop in search of rats. "But why? You said Lestat shouldn't have made you start with people. Do you mean for you it was an aesthetic choice, not a moral one?" Had you asked me then, I would have told you it was aesthetic, that I wished to understand death in stages, that the death of an animal yielded such pleasure and experience to me that I had only begun to understand it, and wished to save the experience of human death for my mature understanding. But it was moral, because all aesthetic decisions are moral, really. I don't understand," said the boy. "I thought aesthetic decisions could be completely immoral. What about the cliché of the artist who leaves his wife and children so he can paint? Or Nero playing the harp while Rome burned? Both were moral decisions. Both served a higher good in the mind of the artist. The conflict lies between the morals of the artist and the morals of society, not between aesthetics and morality. But often this isn't understood, and here comes the waste, the tragedy. An artist, stealing paints from a store, for example, imagines himself to have made an inevitable but more immoral decision, and then he sees himself as fallen from grace. What follows is despair and petty irresponsibility, as if morality were a great glass world which can be utterly shattered by one act. But this was not my great concern then. I did not know these things then. I believed I killed animals for aesthetic reasons only, and I hedged against the great moral question of whether or not by my very nature I was damned. But you see, though, Lestat had never said anything about devils or hell to me. I believed I was damned when I went over to him, just as Judas must have believed it when he put the noose around his neck. You understand. The boy said nothing. He started to speak, but didn't. The color burned for a moment in blotches on his cheeks. "Were you?" he whispered. The vampire only sat there, smiling, a small smile that played on his lips like the light, The boy was staring at him now, as if he were just seeing him for the first time. "Perhaps," said the vampire, drawing himself up and crossing his legs, "we should take things one at a time. Perhaps I should go on with my story." "Yes, please," said the boy. "I was agitated that night, as I told you. I had hedged against the question as a vampire, and now it completely overwhelmed me, and in that state I had no desire to live. Well, this produced in me, as it can in humans, a craving for that which will satisfy at least physical desire. I think I used it as an excuse. I have told you what the kill means to vampires. You can imagine from what I've said the difference between a rat and a man. I went down into the street after Lestat and walked for blocks. The streets were muddy then. The actual blocks is lands above the gutter. The actual blocks islands above the gutters, and the entire city so dark compared to the cities of today. The lights were as beacons in a black sea. Even with morning rising slowly, only the dormers and high porches of the houses were emerging from the dark, and to a mortal man the narrow streets I found were like pitch. Am I damned? Am I for the devil? Is my very nature that of a devil? I was asking myself over and over, and if it is, why then do I revolt against it? Tremble when Babette hurls a flaming lantern at me, turn away in disgust when Lestat kills. What have I become in becoming a vampire? Where am I to go? And all the while, as the death wish caused me to neglect my thirst grew hotter. My veins were veritable threads of pain in my flesh, my temples throbbed, and finally I could stand it no longer. Torn apart by the wish to take no action, to starve, to wither in thought on the one hand, and driven to kill on the other, I stood in an empty, desolate street, and heard the sound of a child crying. She was within. I drew close to the walls, trying in my habitual detachment only to understand the nature of her cry. She was weary and aching and utterly alone. She had been crying for so long now that soon she would stop from sheer exhaustion. I slipped my hand up under the heavy wooden shutter and pulled it so the bolt slipped. There she sat in the dark room beside a dead woman, a woman who'd been dead for some days. The room itself was cluttered with trunks and packages as though a number of people had been packing to leave, but the mother lay half-clothed, her body already in decay, and no one else was there but the child. It was moments before she saw me, and when she did, she began to tell me that I must do something to help her mother. She was only 5 at most, and very thin, and her face was stained with dirt and tears. She begged me to help. They had to take a ship, she said, before the plague came. Their father was waiting. She began to shake her mother now and to cry in the most pathetic and desperate way, and then she looked at me again and burst into the greatest flow of tears. You must understand that by now I was burning with the physical need to drink. I could not have made it through another day without feeding, but there were alternatives. Rats abounded in the streets, and somewhere very near a dog was howling hopelessly. I might have fled the room had I chosen, and fed and gotten back easily. But the question pounded in me. Am I damned? If so, why do I feel such pity for her gaunt face? Why do I wish to touch her tiny, soft arms, hold her now on my knee as I am doing, feel her bend her head to my chest as I gently touch the satin hair? Why do I do this? If I am damned, I must want to kill her. I must want to make her nothing but food for a cursed existence, because being damned, I must hate her. And when I thought of this, I saw Babette's face contorted with hatred when she held the lantern waiting to light it. And I saw Lestat in my mind and hated him. And I felt, yes, damned. And this is hell. And in that instant I had bent down and driven hard into her soft, small neck, and, hearing her tiny cry, whispered even as I felt the hot blood on my lips. It's only for a moment. and there'll be no more pain. But she was locked to me, and I was soon incapable of saying anything. For 4 years I had not savored a human. For 4 years I hadn't really known, and now I heard her heart in that terrible rhythm, and such a heart! Not the heart of a man or an animal, but the rapid, tenacious heart of the child, beating harder and harder, refusing to die, beating like a tiny fist on a door, crying, "I will not die, I will not die, I cannot die, I cannot die." I think I rose to my feet, still locked to her, the heart pulling my heart faster with no hope of cease, the rich blood rushing too fast for me, the room reeling, and then, despite myself, I was staring over her bent head, her open mouth, down through the gloom at the mother's face, and through the half-masked lids her eyes gleamed at me as if they were alive. I threw the child down. She lay like a jointless doll, and, turning in blind horror of the mother to flee, I saw the window filled with a familiar shape. It was Lestat, who backed away from it now, laughing, his body bent as he danced in the mud street. "Louis, Louis," he taunted me, and pointed a long, bone-thin finger at me, as if to say he'd caught me in the act. And now he bounded over the sill, brushing me aside, and grabbed the mother's stinking body from the bed and made to dance with her. "Good God," whispered the boy. "Yes, I might have said the same," said the vampire. He stumbled over the child as he pulled the mother along in widening circles, singing as he danced, her matted hair falling in her face as her head snapped back and a black fluid poured out of her mouth. He threw her down. I was out of the window and running down the street, and he was running after me. "Are you afraid of me, Louis?" he shouted. "Are you afraid? The child's alive, Louis. You left her breathing. Shall I go back and make her a vampire? We could use her, Louis, and think of all the pretty dresses we could buy for her, Louis. Wait, Louis, I'll go for her if you say." And so he ran after me all the way back to the hotel, all the way across the rooftops where I hoped to lose him, until I leaped in the window of the parlor and turned in rage and slammed the window shut. He hit it, arms outstretched, like a bird who seeks to fly through glass, and shook the frame. I was utterly out of my mind. I went round and round the room, looking for some way to kill him. I pictured his body burned to a crisp on the roof below. Reason had altogether left me, so that I was consummate rage, and when he came through the broken glass, we fought as we'd never fought before. It was hell that stopped me, the thought of hell, of us being two souls in hell that grappled in hatred. I lost my confidence, my purpose, my grip. I was down on the floor then, and he was standing over me, his eyes cold, though his chest heaved. "You're a fool, Louis," he said. His voice was calm. It was so calm it brought me around. "The sun's coming up," he said, his chest heaving slightly from the struggle, his eyes narrow as he looked at the window. I'd never seen him quite like this. The fight had got the better of him in some way, or something had. "Get in your coffin," he said to me without even the slightest anger. "But tomorrow night we talk." Well, I was more than slightly amazed. Lestat talk? I couldn't imagine this. Never had Lestat and I really talked. I think I have described to you with accuracy our sparring matches, our angry go-rounds. "He was desperate for the money, for your houses," said the boy. "Or was it that he was as afraid to be alone as you were?" These questions occurred to me. It even occurred to me that Lestat meant to kill me, some way that I didn't know, you see. You see, I wasn't sure then why I awoke each evening when I did, whether it was automatic when the death-like sleep left me, and why it happened sometimes earlier than at other times. It was one of the things Lestat would not explain, and he was often up before me. He was my superior in all the mechanics, as I've indicated, and I shut the coffin that morning with a kind of despair. I should explain now, though, that the shutting of the coffin is always disturbing. It is rather like going under a modern anesthetic on an operating table. Even a casual mistake on the part of an intruder might mean death. But how could he have killed you? He couldn't have exposed you to the light. He couldn't have stood it himself. That is true, but rising before me, he might have nailed my coffin shut, or set it afire. The principal thing was, I didn't know what he might do. What he might know that I still did not know. But there was nothing to be done about it then, and with thoughts of the dead woman and child still in my brain, and the sun rising, I had no energy left to argue with him, and lay down to miserable dreams. "You do dream," said the boy. "Often," said the vampire. "I wish sometimes that I did not. For such dreams, such long and clear dreams, I never had as a mortal, and such twisted nightmares I never had either. In my early days, these dreams so absorbed me that often it seemed I fought waking as long as I could, and lay sometimes for hours thinking of these dreams until the night was half gone, and dazed by them, I often wandered about, seeking to understand their meaning. They were in many ways as elusive as the dreams of mortals. I dreamed of my brother, for instance, that he was near me in some state between life and death, calling to me for help. And often I dreamed of Babette, and often, almost always, there was a great wasteland backdrop to my dreams. That wasteland of night I'd seen when cursed by Babette, as I've told you. It was as if all figures walked and talked on the desolate home of my damned soul. I don't remember what I dreamed that day, perhaps because I remember too well what Lestat and I discussed the following evening. I see you're anxious for that, too. Well, as I've said, Lestat amazed me in his new calm, his thoughtfulness. But that evening I didn't wake to find him the same way. Not at first. There were women in the parlor. The candles were a few, scattered on the small tables and the carved buffet, and Lestat had his arm around one woman. He was kissing her. She was very drunk and very beautiful, a great drugged doll of a woman, with her careful coif falling slowly down on her bare shoulders and over her partially bared breasts. The other woman sat over a ruined supper table drinking a glass of wine. I could see that the three of them had dined, Lestat pretending to dine. You would be surprised how people do not notice that a vampire is only pretending to eat. And the woman at the table was bored. All this put me in a fit of agitation. I did not know what Lestat was up to. If I went into the room, the women would turn their attentions to me. And what was to happen? I couldn't imagine, except that Lestat meant for us to kill them both. The woman on the settee was with him already. The woman on the settee with him was already teasing about his kisses, his coldness, his lack of desire for her, and the woman at the table watched with black almond eyes that seemed to be filled with satisfaction. When Lestat rose and came to her, putting his hands on her bare white arms, she brightened. Bending now to kiss her, he saw me through the crack in the door, and his eyes just stared at me for a moment. And then he went on talking with the ladies. He bent down and blew out the candles on the table. "It's too dark in here," said the woman on the couch. "Leave us alone," said the other woman. Lestat sat down and beckoned her to sit in his lap, and she did. Putting her left arm around his neck, her right hand smoothing his yellow hair. "Your skin's icy," she said, recoiling slightly. "Not always," said Lestat, and then he buried his face in the flesh of her neck. I was watching all this with fascination. Lestat was masterfully clever and utterly vicious. But I didn't know how clever he was until he sank his teeth into her now, his thumb pressing on her throat, his other arm locking her tight so that he drank his fill without the other woman even knowing. "Your friend has no head for wine," he said, slipping out of the chair and seating the unconscious woman there, her arms folded under the face of the table. "She's stupid," said the other woman, who had gone to the window and had been looking out at the lights. New Orleans was then a city of many low buildings, as you probably know, and on such clear nights as this, the lamplit streets were beautiful from the high windows of this new Spanish hotel, and the stars of those days hung low over such dim lights as they do at sea. "I can warm that cold skin of yours better than she can." She turned to Lestat, and I must confess I was feeling some relief that he would now take care of her as well. But he planned nothing so simple. "Do you think so?" he said to her. He took her hand, and she said, "Why, you're warm." You mean the blood had warmed him?" said the boy. "Had warmed him," said the boy. "Oh yes," said the vampire. "After killing, a vampire is as warm as you are now." And he started to resume then, glancing at the boy, he smiled. As I was saying, Lestat now held the woman's hand in his and said that the other had warmed him. His face, of course, was flushed, much altered. He drew her close now, and she kissed him, remarking through her laughter that he was a veritable furnace of passion. "Ah, but the price is high," he said to her, affecting sadness. "Your pretty friend." He shrugged his shoulders. "I exhausted her." And he stood back as if inviting the woman to walk to the table, and she did, a look of superiority on her small features. She bent down to see her friend, but then lost interest until she saw something. It was a napkin. It had caught the last drops of blood from the wound in the throat. She picked it up, straining to see it in the darkness. "Take down your hair," said Lestat softly, and she dropped it, indifferent, and took down the last tresses so that her hair fell blonde and wavy down her back. "Soft," he said, "so soft. I picture you that way, lying on a bed of satin." "Such things you say," she scoffed and turned her back on him playfully. Do you know what manner of bed?" he asked. And she laughed and said his bed, she could imagine. She looked back at him as he advanced, and never once looking away from her, he gently tipped the body of her friend so that it fell backwards from the chair and lay with staring eyes upon the floor. The woman gasped. She scrambled away from the corpse, nearly upsetting a small end table. The candle went over and went out. "Put out the light, and then put out the light," Lestat said softly, and then he took her into his arms like a struggling moth and sank his teeth into her. "But what were you thinking as you watched?" asked the boy. "Did you want to stop him the way you wanted to stop him from killing Frenier?" "No," said the vampire. "I could not have stopped him, and you must understand I knew that he killed humans every night. Animals gave him no satisfaction whatsoever. Animals were to be banked on when all else failed, but never to be chosen. If I felt any sympathy for the women, it was buried deep in my own turmoil. I still felt in my chest the little hammer heart of that starving child. I still burnt with the questions of my own divided nature. I was angry that Lestat had staged this show for me, waiting till I woke to kill the women, and I wondered again if I might somehow break loose from him, and felt both hatred and my own weakness more than ever. And that's where we're going to leave it for today. Alright, so what are the main points that kind of come up in that section of roughly 10 pages? We've got a couple of points that lead in. I think probably over the next 10 pages we'll be able to address them, but I'll introduce them where they come up here and then expand on them tomorrow. But one that we can definitely observe from this section is the point regarding Louis' aesthetic morality. Aesthetic morality is a notion that comes up consistently throughout all the Vampire Chronicle books I've read, where this notion of the aesthetic as truly moral, and the aesthetic as a higher purpose beyond what social values would be, what society would perceive as moral or right. And if you are familiar with this concept, undoubtedly, my observations thus far in this series seem counterintuitive, because I've been analyzing this text from the perspective of the abject immorality of basically every character, when the series is about this aesthetic morality in the same kind of way that the picture of Dorian Gray would be. But interestingly enough, there's a lot of parallels between this text and the picture of Dorian Gray. Lestat is himself kind of this unrepentant Dorian Gray figure. He is beautiful, eternally youthful, and he takes a particular interest in the ruining of young men. Interesting parallels there, and a few critics have described him as this kind of Dorian Gray figure. The only problem with aesthetic morality as it is described, and I'm not going to say proposed by this text, but definitely relied upon by the main characters, is that it's nonsense. The suffering that they wreak is tangible, and more often than not reflects back upon them. So even if you take this selfish utilitarian notion where everything is about their own personal happiness, it doesn't even work in that respect, because more often than not, they end up more unhappy because of their decisions than anything else. Only Lestat really achieves this kind of true aestheticism where he goes about the place and acting purely for aesthetic purposes. And he is monstrous. I cannot perceive anyone actually wanting to mimic Lestat's behavior if they had any ounce of empathy within their body. If you especially what we're going to look at in regards to the way he behaves. But we'll talk about Louis first, because Louis in particular, he talks about this aesthetic morality, and he talks about the notion of damnation within this section as well. And the essential premise being, if he is damned, if his nature as a vampire is to be damned, then he may as well live up to that and act in a manner befitting that. And the problem with this is it's yet another instance of Louis using a constructed coping mechanism in order to excuse his own actions, in order to pretend that he's actually in the right the whole time. Louis's main struggle with damnation is that he fails to realize that the only person making him do the things he does is him. Whenever Louis makes an evil decision, more often than not, it's just him who did it. For all the whining and going on about how damned and cursed he is, there's nothing stopping him from not doing it. It never forces him to be evil. He just uses it to excuse his own evil. And I get that Anne Rice herself has said that the vampires in these texts are supposed to represent kind of societal outcasts, the people on the fringes of society, where they're trying to get by when the rest of the world rejects them. Which we see that in Louis' referencing to society's morality. But I think the problem with this is it feels very clumsy in its representation of people who go against the social grain, because the way these vampires transgress social norms is primarily through murder and horrifically evil cruelty, which feels almost more as a negative portrayal. You could see them quite handily as a conservative portrayal of the kind of danger that these degenerate deviants bring onto our society, as opposed to anything which actually represents someone who is genuinely persecuted by society's moral structure. They're not persecuted by society's moral structure. If anything, their behavior vindicates society's moral structure in how horrifically evil they behave. The only thing I can think of off the top of my head that really does transgress social norms and is quite interesting is the homoerotic relationship between Lestat and Louis. But even then, that relationship is abusive. It's founded on Lestat's abuse, gaslighting, manipulation, just utter mistreatment and belittlement of Louis at every turn. And it's acknowledged consistently throughout the text. So I can't even present that as like a good example of them deviating from social norms, because it's just not really. We get this, like, it feels like the text is constantly saying to us, nothing means anything, so morality doesn't exist, so in reality it's okay that I'm behaving in this way because it's for my own benefit. And I'm like, yeah, I get it, morality doesn't exist, now stop being such a dick. An example of this that we see is we're reminded again that Louis just could feed off animals if he wants. But he instead chooses to feed on Claudia, on the child that he finds in the alleyway. And then he pretends that he didn't really choose to do it. He pretends that he did it because he was damned and he was suffering this incredible moral conflict. And when you hear that, it's just like, yeah, but you did choose to do it. Nothing forced you to behave in that evil way. No, you weren't rebelling against society's morals in doing so. You were just being evil, really. And he tries to explain it away. Every time Louis does something bad, he explains it away under these abstract concepts. If there's something to say for Lestat that we'll at least see in coming text, he owns that he's a horrible, horrible person. He accepts that the way he behaves is purely selfishness. I don't think that vindicates him, but I think it makes him more interesting in this regard. Lestat justifies the reason he doesn't eat animals as that it just doesn't feel as good. This epitomizes selfishness. It is morally abhorrent, but it is an interesting thing to look at, and it definitely makes Lestat's character more interesting. Another thing we see in this section, introduced for the first time in the text, is the character of Claudia. We don't get her by name yet, and there is a better chance to talk about Claudia as we kind of go further into her, and we actually get a more thorough introduction. But for now, a couple of points that I want to bring up regarding Claudia that we can observe here and then keep in mind as we go forward, is the fact that Claudia is found in an alleyway, in a plague-ridden alleyway, kind of the epitome of an impoverished situation. She is very poor and of very relative low birth, which is a serious contrast to the wealthy upbringing of the other vampires. Louis and Lestat are aristocratic. I don't think we get a confirmation of Lestat's aristocracy in this text. It doesn't particularly matter because of the point I'll try and make a bit further on. But Louis is definitely very, very wealthy and has an aristocratic air to him. So it will be interesting to observe as the text goes forward how Claudia acts when taken out of this environment and brought into the vampiric uber class that they essentially have created for themselves. Another thing we should keep in mind when looking in this regard is that Interview with the Vampire was written in the aftermath of the death of Anne Rice's own daughter, who I understand died quite young. And in the character of Claudia, I think we can see this grief being manifested consistently. And spoiler, by the way, if you don't know, but Claudia becomes a vampire herself. And in that, I want to consider as we go the essence of this kind of motherly desire to keep a child young forever. You see it all the time, where one of the most common desires that parents have for their children is that they could just stay young forever and keep in that kind of state of stasis in transience. But we'll see how the text comments on that notion as a child is actually given the opportunity to stay young forever. But as I say, better chances to talk about Claudia as we go a bit further in. Final thing I want to talk about today is Lestat's treatment of female characters. I brought this up a little bit earlier in regards to how his first kill of every night is a woman. But here we see that Lestat's opinion of women appears to be so dismissive almost that to Lestat, violence against women is relegated to a communication method for him. Lestat seems to regularly use brutal acts of violence, particularly against women, as a way of communicating something to Louis. His threats to kill Babette are an example that we've seen before this, but primarily the two women in the flat that we see, where he waits until Louis wakes up to torture them brutally in killing them in order to make a point to Louis. And we'll see, and we'll talk about exactly what that point is tomorrow. But my point now is that he's just using them to communicate a point. In The Vampire Lestat, the next novel, it tries to explain this away almost by pointing out that these two women were actually prostitutes who would drug and murder their clients. And it uses this almost as a way to justify Lestat's behavior in saying that, well, these people were evil, so what he did was actually okay. But it's still really cruel and evil and horrible. It's one of the most disturbing scenes in the text. I think it's one of the greatest instances of Lestat's cruelty that we see within this book. And it's directed against women for a reason, I think. Lestat is kind of this representation of this brutal patriarchal authority that he's going about and using. The female characters of this text are relegated as tools for Lestat to use in his manipulation and in his attempt to get to Louis. They never really ascend beyond that in his eyes. Louis is a little different, and we'll talk about him as that comes up, but that's Lestat's view. It also happens with Claudia, and we'll address this as it comes up, where the turning of Claudia into a vampire is a way of gaining leverage over Louis. And I guess one of the things to talk about here is Louis's reaction to the murder of the women. And it's a very weird reaction, because when he sees the women being killed, he isn't horrified that they're dying. He makes some comment like his own inner turmoil was too great to truly be worried about it. He has this narcissistic response where while these two women are getting murdered in front of him, he's just upset that it's being done to send a message to him. He's not upset that they're being murdered. He doesn't attempt to actually stop the murder. He just kind of whines and focuses on himself. And again, I want to reiterate, every time Louis has the opportunity to do the right thing, he excuses it away. He reasons himself out of being a good person. He's so desperate to pretend he's damned that he acts in that way. Which I think is one of the most interesting things to talk about in regards to Louis's character, because I think it's a really interesting characterization. That they're like vampires, and particularly Louis, they're narcissistic, they're selfish. They are, at the end of the day, really bad people. And I think in this regard, my reading of this text probably contradicts a lot of what was quote-unquote intended in the way it's presented. And I mean, I think that's definitely the case if you look at the content of the later novels. But I think it's still valid, and I think it's still interesting, because to me, this novel is at its strongest when you accept that Lestat and Louis are not representations of social outcasts. They're instead representative of kind of these monumental, capitalistic, patriarchal entities that are engaging in horrible behavior. And simultaneously, they are also just terrible people who make excuses for their own immorality. And we've all met people like that. We've all met people who are behaving in a bad way, but have come up with all manner of excuses to justify their own hurting people. And it's not okay, and it will never be okay. And that's why Lestat and Louis are bad people. But anyway, sorry, I'm going to try and keep going back onto this train of Lestat and Louis being bad people, but I do think it's a central theme of the text, so I'll still bring it up where I think it's relevant. Anyway, that is another day of reading and analysis. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again tomorrow for some more.